from education, from information technology. Look how much more diverse this crowd is today than it was 50 years ago when the library was dedicated. But the world has... But the world has three huge problems. It is unequal and growing increasingly so. It is unstable because of terror and the prospect of global disease threats and weapons of mass destruction. And it is unsustainable because of the threat of climate change and resource depletion. If we would like there to be a 100th anniversary celebration of Harry Truman's library, we have to apply the lessons of Harry Truman's legacy to the current day. Now, what is that legacy and how do we mean to apply it? Well, first, we need a goal. In a globalized world, it's not just America that needs a more perfect union, the world needs it. We can't just sit by with an interdependence that is unequal, unstable, and unsustainable. We need communities that are more equal in terms of giving people opportunity, communities in which everyone feels a responsibility for the success of the enterprise, and communities in which there is a genuine sense of belonging. If you look at the latest terrible terror story coming out of the United Kingdom, think of it, 3 cars full of explosives and nails designed to kill people, apparently all loaded by a cabal of medical doctors from different countries who came to the United Kingdom to find a home. They were not invaders, and as far as anyone knows to date, they were not terrorists when they showed up there. But they felt no sense of belonging. Their identity was so different from that of the country they inhabited that they were willing to contradict the very reason of their professional life to advance some other identity. So what's all that got to do with Truman? Well, I believe that we can only build a world with more communities, locally, nationally, and globally, unless we do the following 4 things. First, we do have to have a security policy that recognizes that we must have a strong military, but no matter how strong it is, it will never be possible to kill, jail, or occupy everybody that's against us, because we live in an interdependent world. Now, if that's true, it means both in military and non-military ways, our policy should be to cooperate with others whenever we can and act alone only when there is absolutely no other alternative. So, that was Truman's policy at the end of World War II. The United Nations was the dream of Franklin Roosevelt, but Harry Truman oversaw its beginning and supported it completely. NATO was a cooperative alliance designed to counter the threat of communism. The Truman Doctrine held that we would support anyone with military assistance if they would stand against communism. Didn't matter if they were some little country on the far reaches of the Cold War's long divide. We knew we had to do it together. I think if Harry Truman were here today, he would remind us of these things. Even the Korean War, let me remind you, was fought with the United Nations mandate, partly because the Soviets were dumb enough to walk out before the vote was taken. But he had it nonetheless. So if Truman were alive today, what would he say? I think he would say, no matter how painful it is, you have to stay the course in Afghanistan. We have to win there. The world wants to win. We have to roll back the Taliban. We can't let al-Qaeda have more running room. We have to stand there. On Iraq, he would say, I think, that we jumped the gun, should have let the inspectors finish, but we are where we are. I hope we can protect the Kurds and at least give them a chance to hold together, but it's fundamentally a civil war, and they're going to have to resolve it. But our military, as I say everywhere, by incurring more casualties from Americans, has dramatically reduced the number of deaths that would have occurred in the last 3 years among Iraqis. I don't support the policy. I don't think he would have. But how to get from here to where we need to be will not be easy. I think he would support President Bush in finally adopting a diplomatic approach to North Korea and in talking to the Iranians and to the Syrians about what to do in Iraq. We talked to the Soviets throughout the Cold War, and they were threatening to blow us off the face of the earth and erase us from human history. It's not weak to talk to people who are against you. I believe Harry Truman would have supported the international agreements on climate change, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and the International Criminal Court for War Criminals once our soldiers were protected by the agreements that we made because we were in countries where the UN asked us to go. In other words, I think the legacy of Harry Truman in the UN, in NATO, in the Truman Doctrine would say we have to have a military plus strategy. We have to cooperate whenever we can and act alone only if we're forced to, because there's so few things we can accomplish alone in an interdependent world. The second thing I think Truman would say is that in any environment where you can't kill, jail, or occupy everyone who is or might be against you, you have to try to make a world with more partners and fewer enemies. Don't forget, that's what I did with the Marshall Plan, and it was the best money America ever spent. I think if you look at the diplomatic successes of the United States in the last 6 years, in the Bush years, arguably the most successful military operation we have conducted in a Muslim country, except for what was done in Afghanistan after 9/11, was the humanitarian relief in Indonesia, the world's biggest Muslim country after the tsunami. Approval of the United States went from 30 to 60% because our helicopters dropped food and medicine, and our government workers were there helping put people's lives back together, and our religious and non-religious, non-governmental groups were there helping people put their lives back together. I worked there for more than 2 years, first with former President Bush and helping to raise funds to solve problems, and then as a UN coordinator. And I saw this. A country of over 200 million people, 98% of them Muslim, who were completely against us because of our policy in Iraq. Once we established human contact, realized our better selves. And interestingly enough, after the tsunami, approval of Osama bin Laden a year later had dropped from 58 down to 28%. Not because he did anything to them, but because he didn't do anything for them. And when you're flat on your back and your kids are dead, or your parents are gone, or you have to start your business all over again, all of a sudden the ability of some crackpot to blow up one more bomb in Bali doesn't amount to a hill of beans compared to the willingness of an American soldier to put your kid back in school. And so if you think about the Marshall Plan, Harry Truman sold it. He said, look, this is not aid, this is an investment. The same sort of investments we made in the American community just before and not long after I was born. When I was born in Arkansas at the end of World War II, our per capita income was about half the national average. We had a lot of people that had no sewer systems, drank water out of a well, didn't even have everybody with electricity then. The REA hadn't reached everybody. And our last remote village didn't get telephone service till 1966. No self-respecting politician of either party could have ever run for office in Arkansas saying a water and sewer program or a telephone extension initiative or the REA was somehow foreign aid to poor people who lived in rural America. Why? Because we recognized we were part of the same community, and investing in us helped all of America grow stronger. That was the argument Truman made about the Marshall Plan. Investing in Europe and in Japan, helping them grow stronger, built us the best allies we had in the Cold War and enabled us and them to build the greatest middle class the world had ever seen. That is the argument we need to make today when we think about how cheap it would be to follow the proposals made in the Congress, including one my wife made, to put the 130 million kids in the world who never go to school in school. At the end of at the end of my presidency, Bob Dole and George McGovern, who jointly sponsored the food stamp program in the late 60s, came to see me with an idea to give money to poor countries to feed their kids once a day who were hungry, but only if the kids came to school to get the meal. So I scrounged up $300 million through the Agriculture Department budget. And we did this, listen to this. School enrollments in the countries where we put this money increased by 6 million. It cost you $50 a kid to put these kids in school for a year. And we made a lot more friends and fewer adversaries. We know what it would cost to build the health systems in the world to deal with AIDS, TB, malaria, and infections related to dirty water. Believe it or not, those four things claim 1 in 4 of all the lives of people who will die this year. From all the heart attacks, strokes, wars, accidents, terrorist incidents, natural disasters, you name it, 1 in 4 people will die of those things, and nearly no Americans will. And it's not that expensive. So in the places where the Bush administration has put AIDS money, either through the Global Fund on AIDS, TB, and Malaria, or through America's own AIDS program, people think better of us because we're helping their kids to live. It's a pretty good incentive. We know what it costs to help people who are poor, like most of our folks were, work their way out of poverty in the same ways that a lot of us, our families, did. Last year, Muhammad Yunus of Bangladesh won the Nobel Peace Prize for running the Grameen Bank for 32 years and making about 8 million loans now, 97% of them to village women with an almost 99% repayment rate. Here's the most important thing. When he started, the per capita income of that country was less than $1 a day. Today, it's about $500. Last year, the economy grew 6% through a cataclysmic political crisis. You know why? Because 58% of the people who borrowed that money used it to lift themselves above the international poverty line, and so many people got it, it lifted the whole country. It's an investment when we invest in those things. And we ought to think about it just like the programs that worked in America when we had 25% unemployment in the Great Depression. It's cheap, and it's always cheaper than going to war. I'll just give you just one example. I've already told you, I strongly support what we've done in Afghanistan. We spent over $100 billion there. We spent $500 billion, probably plus now, in Iraq. There's about 25 million people there. If we signed on to this agenda whole hog, that is, if we said only the rich countries in the world will finance these health, education, and development initiatives necessary to achieve the so-called Millennium Development Goals of the United Nations cost our country about $40 billion, maybe a little less now because of all the money we're already spending. Sounds like a lot of money, but the government budget this year, I think, is something like $2.8 trillion. Is that about right, Ike? Something like that. I'm kind of rusty on those numbers. But that's about right. In other words, we could help 2 billion people, 2 billion people for approximately 5 months of the Iraq budget on $25 billion. So this, I'm not talking about whether you support or oppose the policy. Assume you support it 100%. It's still expensive. And Harry Truman, I believe, would say, look, you got to spend some money, like I did with the Marshall Plan, to make a world with more partners and fewer enemies. It's always cheaper than going to war. The third thing I think we should remember about Truman's legacy is that in the midst of all these problems in the world, which required this guy who was a county judge in Missouri and then became a senator, whose major foreign policy experience, except for fighting in World War I, bravely and well, was looking into waste in defense expenditures as a senator. Then, less than 3 months after he becomes vice president, I guess we still had inaugurations in March then, much less. Whenever it was, January, it was about 3 months, he becomes the President of the United States. What he really had was a lifetime of reading, steeping in history, paying attention to what was going on in the world, looking at the world around him. He has to deal with all these questions. He could have been forgiven if he abandoned any domestic issues, except how do you convert from a war to a peacetime economy without having a collapse? He had to deal with that. But he didn't forget. He kept pushing civil rights. He not only ended discrimination in the military, he ended it in federal employment generally, which was quite significant at the time and more likely to show up in the lives of Americans and communities all over the country. And he did try to do health care because he realized that it was both socially unjust and in the end would be economically stupid. And he was sure right about both. So I would say to all of us, no matter how much we worry about terror, all these other things, we have to continually engage in home improvement. The American people will never support doing these things around the world unless they believe we're making the American dream more real here at home. And if you look at the challenges of America today, I love talking about this because I never had a nickel to my name till I got out of the White House. I had, according to some, I read some historians said my net worth was even lower than Harry Truman's when I went in real dollar terms. But I made a lot of money, and then I became very important to the current government. But I want to talk about, this is serious. We are in the 6th year of an economic recovery. And these trends that I'm going to mention are being mirrored throughout the world. In this recovery, we have a 40-year high in corporate profits, an all-time high in the stock market. Every year, our worker productivity has improved, so the working people have done their job. But median wages, not average, because that includes the rich, really rich people, median, the ones in the middle, are flat, and there has been an increase in the percentage of people working full-time falling below the poverty line, and an increase in the percentage of people working full-time who have lost, along with their families, health insurance coverage. Over half of all the bankruptcies in America today are caused by health emergencies. Health insurance premiums have risen by 90%, 6.5 times the increase in average wages when median wages haven't increased at all. So it is obvious that home improvement requires us to do something to restore middle-class growth. That's the only way poor people can work their way into the middle class. This is something that I would say to members of my party. You can't help poor people if you don't have an expanded middle class. The definition of not being poor anymore is being in the middle class. So in the last time we had 5 years in a row of rising median wages was the last 5 years of my term, when we had lots of new jobs. Now, wait a minute. Wait. I'd like to tell you it's because Bob Rubin and I were economic geniuses, but that doesn't tell the whole story. That happened because we've been having this wage problem for over 30 years now, by the way. We had flat wages from 1972 until 1994 or 5. Then we had 5 years of rising median wages and declining inequality. Why? Because we had both good support policies and America created a vast raft of new high-paying jobs. Do you remember what they were? It was when information technology jobs moved out of Silicon Valley into every aspect of American life. Running a bank in Independence is not like what it used to be because of information technology. Running a doctor's office is not what it used to be because of information technology. There is no aspect of American life that has not been affected by this. The explosion occurred in the last half of the 90s. It was 8% of our total employment, 28% of our job growth, over 33% of our wage growth. Therefore, the whole structure of America's living was lifted. And we had no increase in inequality. Now it's resumed again. So we have to deal with inequality, and we have to deal with health care because it's about to bankrupt the economy and because it's unjust. We're the only rich country in the world that doesn't cover everybody. 16% of our people have no health insurance. We spend 16% of our income on health care. Canada, the next most expensive country, spends 11%. Switzerland spends a tad more, but they have 17.5% of their people over 65. And people are more expensive as they get older. America's at 12% over 65, more than the global average. The difference in 11 and 16 is $700 billion a year. So we're spending $700 billion a year more than anybody else would under any other system, and we can't figure out how to give health care coverage to everybody. Which feeds another problem. We're great at treating sickness. I'm Exhibit A, right? If we weren't great at treating sickness, somebody else would be here giving a speech. And when you visit my library, you could also visit my gravesite. Because my life was saved by the best of American medicine with my heart bypass surgery. But we're lousy at keeping people well. And we know how to do it. Safeway last year started paying for all preventive and primary health services for their employees. No copay, no nothing. You know how much their health insurance premiums went up this year? 0. So we have to find a way to cover everybody, bring costs in line with our competitors, and treat wellness, help people stay well, as well as treat them when they're sick. It's a big deal to me now because I work with the American Heart Association to try to combat the rising tide of childhood obesity and the attendant explosion in diabetes, which leads to more heart attacks, strokes, blindness, amputation, horrible things.